Welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where our guest will be Joshua Searle from Spurgeon's College in London. The Schuman Talks are monthly discussions on issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. Today is October the 9th. It is now 6 p.m. It was May the 9th in 1950, 71 years ago at 6 p.m. at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris, when the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, in which today 500 million Europeans live together in peace. This was the defining moment of post-war Europe, for it launched the European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. Speaking of a world peace to end centuries-old rivalries and of Europe's shared destiny and responsibilities to the world, he then proposed an economic project that was a political expression of Christian ideals of forgiveness and reconciliation. The proposal was for a European coal and steel community involving partner nations to cooperate in the production of coal and steel in mutual accountability, making the creation of a national war machine impossible. There has been unprecedented peace between EU member states ever since. Robert Schuman's personal faith was his motivation to enter the public square to promote peace, reconciliation, and justice. It shaped his lifestyle and his politics. And we're going to explore the interface between faith, theology, the public square, politics today, with our guest, Joshua Searle, who's a lecturer in theology and public thought at Spurgeon's College. So, welcome, Joshua. I'm going to stop my screen sharing here so that we can come online. All right, I have lost both of us now. Oh, here we are. Glad you could join us, Joshua. I should say that initially we had advertised that Thomas Schiermarker, the General Director of, or the General Secretary of the World Evangelical Alliance, was going to be with us today, but he had an exceptionally busy week meeting people like the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope, Patriarch Bartholomew, and I'm very grateful that you've agreed to spring in jump in at the last moment. We hope to be joining Thomas again next week. Next month. Now, Joshua, you have a special link yourself with Ukraine. You seem to be wearing, is that Ukrainian jacket that you've got on there?
It is, that's right, Jeff. It's a Ukrainian garment, and it's known as a vyshyvanka. So you can see the Ukrainian style, the Ukrainian patterns. I bought it in Lviv in Western Ukraine.
Okay, but you're not Ukrainian yourself. You grew up in the north of England, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I grew up in the borderlands between England and Scotland in Northumberland, but I do have some close connections with Ukraine.
And tell us about those connections.
Okay, well, I just want to say, first of all, Jeff, it's really great to be with you and to mark this significant occasion of the anniversary of the Schuman Declaration. So it's really good to join you. And I bring with me greetings from students and colleagues at Spurgeon's College in South London. I do currently live and work in South London, but I do have a lot of ties that bind me to Ukraine, you could say. So there are family connections and personal connections and also professional connections. But when I did my first degree in modern history at Oxford University, I focused a lot on the history of Russia and Eastern Europe, and I was particularly fascinated by the history of the Cold War. And so after I'd graduated, I spent a year living and studying in Prague in the Czech Republic, and it was over there in Prague that I made a lot of friends from Ukraine. And there was one friend in particular who became my wife, So my wife is Ukrainian. I suppose my
So you were students together at the Baptist Academy
we was
in Prague.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. We were
Okay.
students together. We taught each other's languages, if I can put it that way. And then the rest, as they say, is history. So my wife is Ukrainian, and I suppose that makes my son half Ukrainian and half English. So I have close family ties in Ukraine. But while I was working on my PhD, which I did at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland, I had lots of opportunities to go and live and do short-term study and teaching in Ukraine. I had an opportunity to learn Russian as well, to learn it properly. And I finished my doctorate in 2012, and I got a job lecturing at Donetsk Christian University, or DCU as it's known, which is in the Far East, or what's known as the Diki Vostok, or the Wild East.
Shall I just bring up that map?
Yeah.
We have a map here that would, and you can explain it from the map.
Yeah, sure. So as I just mentioned there, Jeff, I moved to Donetsk in 2012 to go and work as a lecturer at Donetsk Christian University. You can see Donetsk on the map. It's located right in the eastern corner of Ukraine. And in America, they have the Wild West, but in Ukraine, they have the Wild East. And so it always was quite a difficult, challenging region. It was very difficult to have any kind of Christian presence or to practice mission and ministry in that region. It got even more difficult in 2013-14 in the aftermath of the Maidan demonstrations, the Revolution of Dignity, and the subsequent Russian-led counterinsurgency in the summer of 2014, which developed into a full-scale war. And sadly, the campus of DCU, where I used to work, was invaded and occupied by Russian-backed paramilitary forces. The soldiers turned up one bright summer's day in July 2014. They turned up to the campus in armored personnel carriers, and there was a battalion of soldiers that got out carrying AK-47 rifles and rocket-propelled grenades slung around their shoulders, and they forced out the staff, all of the students, at gunpoint. And many of my former colleagues were deprived of their livelihoods overnight. But this was just a little microcosm, a little snippet of what was going on more generally throughout the whole region, with churches being occupied, their properties being requisitioned by the pseudo authorities that took control in summer 2014. So since that time, I have kept in touch with Ukraine. So I have contact with friends, obviously family as well, including former colleagues at DCU. And I should say as well that although I'm now living in Spurgeon's College, I do still have close contacts with seminaries in Kiev and in Lviv, and I continue my teaching, especially at Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. So I do have a lot of occasion to return to Ukraine. So there are several ties that continue to bind me, not just family ties, but also professional.
No, Lviv is not actually on this map, but it's over towards Poland. In fact, it used to be part of Poland. It's on the western side of Ukraine. Where does your wife's family live?
My wife's family, actually, the family is originally from Armenia, northern Armenia, but they moved over in 1988 in the aftermath of the earthquake. Some of the listeners might be familiar with the devastating earthquake that occurred there, which my wife's family was they were located in the epicenter, very lucky to survive. But long story short, they had to abandon their home as refugees, essentially, and they went in search of a better life in Ukraine, and they settled in the region. It used to be known as Dnipropetrovsk. It's now known as Dnipro. And actually, the name change is quite significant, Jeff, because Dnipropetrovsk was named in honor of one of Stalin's leading henchmen who was responsible for causing the man-made famine of the Holodomor, or the death by starvation, the artificially induced famine that was used for genocidal purposes against the Ukrainian people. And Petrovsky was one of the leading architects of that, and he did such a great job that they decided to name a city after him. So this is one of the sad ironies of Ukrainian history, that the people who are honored, the people who are held in veneration, were some of the most brutal leaders of the Soviet Union. So Dnipropetrovsk is now known as Dnipro, simply the city of Dnipro.
And where is that on this map?
It's located around about, I mean, it's eastern Ukraine, but it's located around about where the D is in Donetsk, if you can see that. Maybe just slightly west of that marker.
Okay. And what's the current situation in Donetsk?
It's pretty dire, to be honest, Jeff. There was a major escalation of the conflict this year in March and April. The war continues. We don't really read about it or hear about it in the news bulletins, but the war is definitely continuing. The situation in the Donetsk region it's essentially become a lawless zone. There are different organized crime factions which control local areas. They feud with each other as much as with their Ukrainian antagonists.
Yeah. Now, help us get a timeline of to put the current situation in the context.
Sure. Well, Ukrainian history is quite complex, but you've helpfully indicated some of the salient.
Yeah, we're starting with recent history.
The more recent history. So you remember in the 1980s, the Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost, and perestroika began to open up Soviet society. And this led to the disintegration, the internal collapse of the whole Soviet system. And a number of the Soviet republics began to break away and to form independent states. And Ukraine declared its independence in 1991. It's 24th of August, 1991 to be precise, which is still celebrated today as Ukrainian Independence Day. And in the early 90s, in the aftermath of independence, there was a general feeling of euphoria. You have to remember, Jeff, that back then this was the time of Francis Fukuyama and the proclamation of the end of history, the alleged victory of the ultimate victory of liberal democracy, the idea that humankind had reached its ideological omega point and the debate was essentially over. Now, this seems
I'm old enough to remember that better than you.
Okay, yeah, I was about 4 or 5 years old at the time. So, but reading these very optimistic prophecies concerning the ideological victory of liberal capitalism, it now seems that those prophecies were very premature, or at least they haven't been fulfilled in the way that was anticipated. And sadly, since the fall of since the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine in the 1990s failed completely. It was a total failure to transition into a functioning democracy. There wasn't a flourishing civil society. There wasn't really any rule of law in Ukrainian society during this period.
Parallel to Russia. Yeah, indeed.
Very parallel to Russia. And Ukraine could have gone the same way as Russia, actually essentially become almost like a failed state under the control of
dictatorial
mafia. But Ukraine, I suppose, like Russia, throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, Ukraine was was cursed with corrupt and incompetent political leadership. And this culminated, as you can see from your slide, in the what's known as the Orange Revolution, 2004, 2005, when millions of Ukrainians took to the streets in protest against this rigged election of the corrupt president, whose name was Viktor Yanukovych. We'll hear more about him a little bit later. But he was essentially a little more than a Russian-backed stooge. He was actually known as Putin's man in Kiev. So he represented the interests of the oligarchs and the Russians, the Kremlin regime that was essentially pulling the strings and drawing Ukraine closer into the Russian orbit. So the thing is, with the Orange Revolution, it was only a temporary victory for the forces of liberalism and European integration, because although Yanukovych was overthrown, the election results were overturned. But in the years following the Orange Revolution, there was infighting among Yanukovych's pro-European opponents, which created the condition for Yanukovych's return to power at the next election. So it's an extraordinary turn of events. But the corruption continued. If anything, it got even worse under Yanukovych throughout the early 2010s. And again, to cut a very long and complex story short and to simplify things a lot, there was another revolution which began in November, December 2013. It began on the central plaza in Kiev, which is known as Maidan Revolution, or Independence Square.
So the word Maidan is really, it comes from the celebration of independence of the Ukraine from the Soviet Union.
It does. The word Maidan, actually, I think it's a word, it's a Ukrainian term. I think it's of Turkish origin, but it simply means square.
Okay.
So English people sometimes, or English-speaking people sometimes refer to Maidan Square incorrectly. That's a misnomer because it simply means square, square.
Yeah,
It should be Maidan Revolution or Independence Square. That's literally the meaning of the term.
Okay.
It has an interesting history, actually, this square, because it was known as Lenin Square for a number of years under the communist regime. And then when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, for a few years, this was known as Adolf Hitler Square. So I think it reverted back to Lenin Square.
Yes,
when Soviets reoccupied it, but now it's known, after the Ukrainian independence, 1991. It's since then it's been known as Independence Square, Maidan Revolution.
So then this revolution was the people's outcry concerning the outcome of the rigged revolutions. And perhaps you can come back and answer this question later, the revolution of dignity. This is actually a photo I took myself. This is the same photo, just blown up. And you can see there those each of those displays is a memorial to people who have died on that spot, or telling stories about what happened in this Maidan Revolution. It is iron, steel plates that have been laser cut. I found the story so moving, and I realized there was so much a story of people reaching out to God. In fact, on one of these pillars, I read the story of a man who said when he heard the church bells ring out, which was a signal in support of the people, that the people would be able to find refuge in the church, I knew there was a God. It seemed like for many people, this was a God moment. So, and yet that's not the full. It was an awful situation. Take us through a little bit, what was happening at that time.
Yeah.
What's this photo all about?
You're right, Jeff. I think you're right to draw attention as well to the role of the church, which was very prominent in these demonstrations. But just to come back to the point about the origins or the causes of Maidan, the causes, the root cause is very complicated. But the immediate proximate cause of Maidan, the revolution, was the refusal of the corrupt oligarchic president Viktor Yanukovych. He refused to sign an association agreement with the European Union, which would have paved the way for Ukraine's closer economic and political integration into the EU. And what's significant, I'm not sure if you can see in the background on that slide that you've got there, Jeff, there are almost as many EU flags as there were Ukrainian flags.
It's hard to see, but yes.
Yeah, and this is significant, I think, because the people on Maidan, there were lots of motivating factors, reasons why people took to the streets, but for a large part, the revolution in the early days was known as the Euro Maidan. And the people were demanding closer integration with Europe. And it should be understood that I know this not just from my reading, but also from my personal connections and friendships with Ukrainians, that in the mind of many Ukrainians, the adjective European is essentially a byword for liberty, justice, openness, tolerance, prosperity, freedom, opportunity, which all of these things which were denied, especially to the younger generation, under the system of communism, but also under the corrupt post-Soviet regime which emerged in the aftermath of the original independence revolution. So for many Ukrainians, Europe is seen as a beacon of light and hope. Now, I don't want to overly romanticize the Maidan revolution. There were a lot of problems, and there were undoubtedly extremist nationalist elements who took advantage of the protests and the unrest, the disorder, and used that for their own purposes. So we need to be careful that we don't gloss over those issues and those problems, and pretend that everything was just sweetness and light. But I think it was a decisive event in the history of the former USSR. And I think it's just a judgment, speaking as a historian. I think that historians of Eastern Europe in 100 years' time will look back on the revolution in Ukraine in 2013 with the same sense of significance as historians of Western Europe view the French Revolution of 1789. It was a decisive shift in the post-Soviet condition.
And the Ukraine itself, I mean, I should not call it the Ukraine.
Yes.
Ukraine is a hinged nation. I'm not sure that we're fully conscious of that here in the West, to realize that what happens in Ukraine in the coming years will be very significant for the whole of the former Soviet Union. And therefore, it's not just something happening on the fringe of Europe. It's actually, you could say it's in the heart of Europe if you take Europe going through to the Urals.
Yes.
But as Western Europeans, often we suffer from a Euro tunnel vision. We're focused on our own area. But just to get a feeling for what was going on, I mean, it really was a battlefield when you see these slides of what was going on there. It was a fearful time mixed in with hope. And what was now you've written about this in the International Journal of Public Theology, and I've taken some of these some of your description of what took place there. So perhaps you could take us through these pages here, and we've got some photos accompanying them as well. Could you read this for us?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, this is from my article in the International Journal of Theology, just drawing attention to public theology, drawing attention to the very prominent role of the church in the Maidan demonstrations, which is quite significant because up until then the church had been largely apolitical, and Maidan was a really decisive event in that respect. So there were Orthodox and Catholic priests carrying icons and crosses, standing alongside Baptist and Pentecostal pastors carrying Bibles, forming a human barrier between the protesters and the riot police.
Here's a photo.
Yes.
Well, that was,
yeah.
Where did have I already done that photo? No. Where is that photo?
Yeah, it's on Maidan. Yes, yeah. So there you go. There you've got the I think the lady on the left is representing the Catholic Church. The gentleman in the orange jacket, that's my good friend Denis, who is a Baptist pastor, and he was representing the Baptists. And you have the different expressions of orthodoxy in Ukraine: Ukrainian Orthodox of the Moscow Patriarchate, Ukrainian Orthodox of the Kiev Patriarchate, and the independent Orthodox churches as well.
So was the Moscow Patriarch actually represented there?
Yes, yeah, there was some division within the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, yeah. but they did participate in the Maidan demonstrations.
Okay, we'll go back to here.
Yeah, so there were prayer tents. Essentially, Maidan Nezalezhnosti Independence Square became an open air shrine. It became a kind of sacred space. So there was a prayer tent that was established. It essentially became around about this time, people began to use the concept of it's known as Tserkov bez stien, or church without walls, because people had been discussing this in academic context and didn't really understand what it meant in practice. And then suddenly, faced with the reality of these events, church without walls took on a new meaning and became a visible reality for many people. So the role of the churches, as I've said, was absolutely pivotal. The marchers were singing Christian hymns in the face of the hail of bullets that were flying around them, shot by Yanukovych's snipers. Sadly, many people died in the demonstrations. More than 100 people, actually. They're known as the Heavenly 100, but it's actually quite a lot more than 100.
Including a number of Christians.
A number of Christians, yes, yeah, including, sadly, one of my best friends in Ukraine. His brother sadly died as well. So it was quite, it did hit quite close to home. But what was interesting in a terrible and morbid sort of way was that when this young man, his name was Alexander, he was a Baptist from Western Ukraine who participated in the riots in Kiev. He was shot dead, shot through the neck by one of Yanukovych's snipers, and he was mortally wounded. And as he lay dying, we received reports that as he lay dying, he received the last rites from a Catholic priest, even though he was a Baptist. So we speak a lot about ecumenism and what does this mean, and usually we mean the signing of consensus documents and discussions occurring in high places. But this was ecumenism in action.
Yes,
ecumenism on the streets, and really quite moving.
Yes.
Yes, and you've displayed here, Jeff, some of the faces of the Heavenly 100, and what struck me was that there were people, the people depicted. Obviously, they were mainly Ukrainians, but there were people from other parts of the former Soviet Union as well. There were Lithuanians, there were Belarusians, there were Armenians, numbered among the dead. There were people of all social backgrounds, manual laborers, workers, teachers, university professors. Sadly, one of the religious studies lecturers who taught at Ukrainian Catholic University was shot and killed on Maidan. So it represents the Nebesny Sotny, as it's known, or the Heavenly 100. represents a wide, broad cross-section of
No,
Ukrainian society.
Joshua, let me just comment on this photo, because the next year, 2015, was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. I was invited to join a number of Ukrainian denominational leaders and politicians, European politicians, in Strasbourg. And it just so happened to be when the man who became president after the revolution, Poroshenko here, chocolate magnate, was present to address the Council of Europe, not to be confused with the European Union, European Council, but the Council of Europe that includes Russia, Turkey, Ukraine. I think it's 52 nations, isn't it? And he came to unveil this plaque to the Heavenly Hundred. You can see that in French, on hommage à la Centurie Celeste, excuse my French. It was going to be, it's now laid there as a monument outside the Council of Europe. You can see all the flagpoles behind these people here of all different flags. I took that photo myself, and I was thrilled to be part of this whole commemoration and discussion with Ukrainian leaders, which actually led to a number of engagements in the Ukraine with church leaders and politicians since then. So this is all to show the ripeness in the Ukraine for understanding, for where they go with their nation in the future. And that will be crucial. It seems to me like it's a hinge nation for the whole of the former Soviet Union. But there is this awful war going on. Tell us about all these faces, Joshua. I also took this photo up by the monastery up above Maidan. There's a story about that monastery. I'm sure you could tell us and who all these people are.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So as I mentioned before, we referred to the Heavenly Hundred. These are the people who were killed on Maidan. But in the aftermath of the Maidan Revolution, there was a counter-insurgency led by Russian, essentially the Russian army and local separatist volunteers in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. Russia invaded and occupied the Crimean Peninsula, and also made incursions into eastern Ukraine, the Donetsk and Lugansk region, which led directly to the deaths of, sadly, the number is increasing almost on a daily basis, but the estimates are around about 12,000 dead as a direct result of the war. Not to mention the 2.5 million internally displaced persons as a result of the war, and the countless tens of thousands of people who have died as an indirect consequence of the war, with the breakdown of the healthcare system and infrastructure, and the poverty and suffering and hardship that the war has created. And what you can see here, this is you might call it a shrine, an open-air shrine on the streets. This is just outside of the Andreyski Sabor, or St. Andrew's Cathedral. Sorry, not St. Andrew's, Mikhailovsky Sabor, St. Michael's Cathedral in central Kiev. And you can see some of the faces of the soldiers and the civilians who have died as a result of the conflict. And one thing that struck me when I was walking past here was the average age of those who were killed. It's mainly young men in their early 20s. So it's quite shocking to see. So the suffering continues, and the persecution of Christians continues as well. So that the evangelical Protestant Christians are suffering disproportionately, even more than the general population in these territories, because they're identified as quote unquote Western spies or Western agents whose allegiance isn't to Holy Mother Russia, but to Western Europe or to North America. Or that's the perception anyway.
Mm.
I mentioned Donetsk Christian University, which continues to be occupied to this day. And we actually received, my friends and I, we were able to access the Russian equivalent of Facebook, and we saw some of the posts or the photographs that were posted by the occupying soldiers, the soldiers who had occupied the campus, the very large campus of Donetsk Christian University, and they've turned it into a military installation. And some of those classrooms where I used to teach about theology and about the light and the hope of the gospel, those classrooms have now been turned into target practice rooms with people firing guns, and it's become a place of real darkness. So I think that's just a little illustration of the spiritual conflict that's taking place, the powers and principalities, if I can use that theological language to describe what's happening over there. Because DCU, the DCU campus was built by Canadian Mennonites in the early 1990s as a place of peace. Yes, and now and so the irony is that a center established and built and funded by pacifists has now become a place of war and militarism and violence.
So coming back to St. Michael's Cathedral here, I think there's also a monastery in the grounds. Is that correct? And was it not true that the church opened the gates for the people to find a refuge there, so that the security people could not come, they would not enter the sanctuary? And yes, this was hugely significant in the sense that generally the Orthodox Church has always sided with the government, because this is the concept of what's the word used, between the kind of a synergy between the church and state, yes, and they would always back up whatever the state was doing. But I don't know if this was the first time, but it's certainly a very unusual step that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kievian Patriarchy, not so much the Moscow Patriarchy, but the Kievian Patriarchy, took the side of the people against the existing state. Would you comment on that?
Yes, well, you're right, Jeff. This very close relationship, we could almost describe it in terms of collusion between the power of the church and the power of the state, has a long historical precedence in Ukrainian or what we call Orthodox theology. So it extends back to Byzantium, the Byzantine period, the idea of the harmonia or the harmony between the ruling authorities of church and state. And this continued well until the Soviet and even the post-Soviet era. The church and state worked in collusion, in harmony. And
well, we see it in Russia presently with Putin presenting himself as the champion of Christianity, the champion of the Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarch. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. And we see the way in which the official Orthodox Church has become or presented itself as the bastion of traditional Christian family values, however we want to turn it. But we have to learn the lessons of history, whether it's authoritarian regimes in Germany, in Hitler's Germany in the 1930s and 40s, or whether it's Putin's Russia today, that these authoritarian regimes can cloak themselves in the garb of traditional family values, resisting the forces of liberalism, and especially the issue right now is homosexuality, and presenting themselves as the guardians of traditional family values. But I think we're sadly seeing examples of how some Christians can be seduced by this delusion, and supporting fascist political parties because they pursue their agenda under the banner of promoting traditional family values, or resisting abortion or gay rights or whatever the issue is, resisting so-called decadent liberal Western Europe and upholding Holy Mother Russia. That's been the governing assumption, which has given tremendous power not just to the Orthodox Church but also to the governing authorities in both Moscow and Kiev. Yeah.
Now, you've given us a general kind of background as to what the Maidan Revolution was all about, and I think it's fairly obvious why it was called the Revolution of Dignity. Here in the International Journal of Public Theology, you have actually, I think you were the guest editor for this edition, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you brought together a number of Ukrainian and international authors to write about the situation there. And I've taken some quotes from your article there, signaling what you've called a seismic shift in Christian public engagement with post-Soviet society that has been marked by the Maidan or the revolution or the Revolution of Dignity. Yes. So let's just go through some of these quotes and you can unpack them for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Jeff, you mentioned there that it might be obvious why the revolution was called the Revolution of Dignity, but I'm not so sure if it's widely known, at least in the West, why the revolution acquired this this name, this title. I think if we want to understand the significance of the concept of dignity in the post-Soviet region, we have to be clear about the Soviet legacy and the way that the Soviet system, Soviet ideology crushed human dignity. And, you know, this Marxist-Leninist ideology, Soviet communism, was inherently hostile to the whole notion of human dignity, human rights, or the freedom of the individual person, the freedom of personality. Actually, the idea of dignity has a long history in Christian thought, but it was given powerful expression in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who spoke about the inherent dignity of what it meant to be a human being. But under the communist Soviet system, the whole idea of human rights and human dignity was seen as a bourgeois illusion, because all that mattered, according to this ideology, was the material condition of social life. So human dignity was crushed and oppressed. And so what we see in the revolution of dignity in Ukraine in 2013 was not simply a political revolution of protesters demanding constitutional change. What we saw was something much deeper. It was a genuine revolution of dignity, to the extent that it was a revolt against the whole ideology, a dehumanizing ideology that subordinated the individual and the dignity and freedom of the individual to the collective identity of society. So under the Soviet system, the individual and the individual's rights meant absolutely next to nothing. And the only thing that mattered was the formless collective. But in the revolution of dignity, we see the emergence of a new spirit of freedom. And this is why I say, and I've written about this at length in my book, The Future and a Hope, that actually what Maidan and the revolution signifies is a revolution of the spirit. It signifies a change, a shift in the spiritual condition of society in Eastern Europe. I'm not restricting myself to Ukraine here. I think that the implications of Maidan extend and ripple outwards beyond the borders of Ukraine and into Russia, but also significantly into Europe, including the nations of Western Europe. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from what happened on Maidan, and to understand the revolution from a theological vocabulary. I think we need a theological vocabulary really to understand the true significance of the resurrection, of the revolution, I should say.
But you're also saying, yeah, this has revealed kind of a mindset amongst evangelicals in former Soviet countries. Very little systematic theological reflection concerning how the gospel has to do with every sphere of life. Christ's lordship over all of life, politics and society, as well as religion and spirituality. And this is not necessary just evangelicals in the former Soviet countries.
Exactly. No, exactly right, Jeff. And this is my basic premise in my latest book, that theology is concerned with life. Theology takes life as its object and its point of departure, not doctrine, but life itself. And this means that there's nothing in human life in the world that is foreign to theology. And so theology needs to be concerned with life in all of its various expressions and guises in the world, in the political, economic sphere. We can't confine ourselves simply to religious discourse and church life. Theology should be concerned with the transformation of the world rather than simply the revival or even the survival of the church. We should be focused on the world.
So the title of your book that you've just referred to?
This is Theology After Christendom.
Theology After Christendom.
Theology After Christendom. What does it mean to be a theologian, or what does it mean to be a Christian in a post-Christian world? That's essentially the basic premise.
So now we're getting to attitudes towards theology. That still in many post-Soviet evangelical churches there's a deep distrust towards the idea of theology and anti-intellectualism. I think that would be true in also many parts of the evangelical world around the world. And what you wrote was a narrow focus on a limited notion of evangelism as a simple verbal proposition or proclamation of gospel truths. Has meant that the act of preaching of the gospel and the coming of the kingdom of God is often degenerated into just superficial moralizing, church issues, personal issues, but not for the welfare of society as a whole. And a private pietistical spirituality to the detriment of solving evident and concrete problems that affect public life in the world. So I'm quoting your statements here in your article. But the good news that you are bringing out is that this lack of theological reflection is now being addressed seriously by the evangelical community, especially in the Ukraine, since the events of Maidan. This revolution of dignity has prompted new thinking directed towards a kind of an appropriate model of public theology. Tell us more about that. When you use the term public theology, and you also talk about how the concepts of freedom, compassion, and creativity could be starting points really for helping the church engage with life of society.
Yes.
Now, I think I'm going to exit the screen here so we can just talk face to face. You're saying here the aim of public theology is not to serve the interests of the church, but the general well-being of society as a whole. Mostly we think of theology as well, issues concerning the church and personal discipleship. But you're saying public theology is aimed at the well-being of society as a whole, like Jeremiah is saying to the exiles, seek the welfare of the city. And okay, so we'll finish off with here. You're talking about a yearning for the kingdom, not just the preservation of the church, should be a hallmark of this public theology.
Yes.
So let's go back to our, how do I find that? I'm stopping sharing here. There we go. Okay, good. I can see you properly. So yes, public theology. Maidan has triggered a new awareness in at least some of the churches in the Ukraine of what theology is all about, or what theology should be all about. Could you comment on the quotes we've just been quoting?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I should say, first of all, I'm not a huge fan of the term public theology because I think it's quite tautological. I think it's a little bit like speaking about unmarried bachelors or about cold ice cream, because I think theology, by its very nature, should be public. And I think that theology that's worth the name, good theology, should serve the cause of the Great Commission, should help the people of God to fulfill the Great Commission, to make disciples of all nations, to go into the world and to transform it in the power of the Holy Spirit. I'm using theological language here, but this is essentially the way that I envision the task
So
of theology.
unpack, let me just interrupt here. I was actually at a conference just last week with Christian leaders in the Netherlands, and a man from an evangelical denomination got up, a man who's well known, written 100 books. He says, there was another speaker mentioning the term public theology. He said, I've never heard this term before. What does it mean?
Yeah.
So for those who do use the term, what are they meaning?
Well, there isn't a universally agreed upon consensus about what public theology means, but according to the International Journal of Public Theology, which is obviously an authoritative source, public theology simply refers to the analysis of the Christian faith, the public expression of Christian faith, and the public use of Christian faith and teachings to the whole of society, as well as to the natural environment. So if you're looking for a kind of one sentence definition of public theology, that's what it refers to.
Theology for the public square. And
yeah,
that being everything that's not included in the church itself and personal life, but the Monday to Saturday, if you like.
The Monday to Saturday, yeah. And actually the whole of life, not just the religious dimension. So theology can't be confined to religious life or to what people do on a Sunday. Theology is concerned with life, and this means that it's a holistic, transformative endeavor. So if we want to understand what public theology means, we need to be clear not just what we mean about the public, kind of beyond the private, beyond the personal, but we also need to be clear about what we mean by theology. And public theology, or as I would prefer to say, theology, should be concerned with the transformation of the world, not simply with the revival of the church. Theology should serve the interests of the kingdom of God rather than the narrow parochial interests of the church or particular churches. So the term is not widely used in Ukrainian context at the moment. This
anywhere
issue
in the West,
well, anywhere, even in the West. But this is the problem, isn't it, Jeff? Because I think in the West and also in Eastern Europe, the Christian community, the global Christian community today, is having to confront some really formidable challenges. We think about some of the challenges of the rise of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, the so-called clash of civilizations, the rise of deadly diseases, global pandemics, etc. And I think one of the problems that we have is that we haven't, as Christians, and I'm speaking of my own evangelical community, as evangelical Christians, we haven't been equipped with the spiritual and intellectual tools that we need even to interpret what's happening in the world, let alone to work towards a solution. So I think there's a lot of work to be done.
So what is Spurgeon College doing about that?
Well, we're trying to encourage our students to think precisely in these terms, to develop a transformative vision of theology that equips them for life, not just for their activities in churches, but equips them to be responsible citizens and citizens of their own country and citizens of heaven, helping them, equipping them, giving them the tools that they need to interpret what Jesus in the Gospels refers to as the signs of the times. what are the signs of the times? How can we live with integrity? How can we embody the truth of Christ in the world beyond the confines of church life? And to help students to understand, it's sometimes said that Karl Barth said that people need to study theology with a Bible in the one hand and a newspaper in the other.
Yes,
nowadays,
John Stott made that popular too. Yeah,
yeah, it's a popularization, but it's a simplification, but there is some truth to it, because we need to make points of connection between the biblical teaching and the life of the gospel and world historical events and processes, and to make the link and to bring the light of the gospel to bear on these urgent and pressing issues in the world today.
Yes. So from the title of your book, A Future and a Hope, you view the future with hope.
Yeah.
On what basis?
Well, absolutely. I think you've referred earlier, Jeff, to Jeremiah's prophecy that the people should seek the welfare of the city, and that the title of that book, A Future and a Hope, is taken from the same passage in Jeremiah's prophecy. So there is reason to hope, and this is why I think we need a theological vocabulary, because hope isn't to be confused with optimism.
No.
Shallow, superficial optimism based on human or political aspirations. In order to confront hope, it's part of the Christian tradition. You can't arrive at Easter Sunday and the hope of the resurrection without first passing through the pain and the suffering and the desolation of Good Friday. So we need to confront the darkness and the despair in the world. Think about what's happening in the world today. Think about the devastation that we've talked about in Eastern Ukraine. Think about the loss of life. We need to face up to the fact that we're living in a post-Christian world, a world that is not being shaped by Christian values. So our world, whether we like it or not, yeah, absolutely, our world is not being shaped by the values of love, compassion, solidarity. The forces that are shaping political life in our world today are power, the lust for power, the racial politics of blood and soil, demonic powers and principalities. Sorry, Jeff.
Let me ask about how would you reconcile that with Tom Holland's discovery? I'm not talking about Spider-Man. I'm talking about the British journalist and author who recently wrote his book Dominion, and we talked with him on Schuman Talks, and he came to the realization that actually our society is still strongly shaped by these Christian values. We don't go to colosseums to watch gladiators kill each other or Christians being eaten by lions. We watch football players who play with rules and the big word respect written everywhere, and there are rules of fair play that came out of really Victorian England, strongly shaped by gospel values. Post-Christian, that term is often used. It's certainly post-Christendom. How would you comment on that if you were dialoguing with Tom?
Yeah, well, I think that that there are examples that could be cited to demonstrate the ongoing influence of, or the ongoing public relevance of Christianity. But I think the overall narrative is one of decline, certainly the decline of official religion, official Christianity. And we see the emergence of new forms of spirituality, the rise of secularism, etc. So I think the overall picture is one of the decline of the churches, the increasing irrelevance of the churches. And one of the reasons, it's not simply because of secularization, it's also because theologians generally have had nothing to say about these urgent developments and events, things that are happening in the world. So I think we need to own our responsibility as well for this decline. Sure, we can cite examples, especially in in North America concerning the ongoing political public relevance of even evangelical Christianity. And I don't know, I don't really know how much to say about what's going on in North America. I don't want to offend any North American listeners that you have on the program, but it seems like the situation there, they're in a hell of a mess when it comes to religion and politics. But that's, I suppose that's another.
Well, that relates to what you're talking about. Actually, we've been tempted to adopt a model that says we've got to gain control of all these different spheres of society. Some people call them mountains, and have a power struggle. And this is part of the lack of an understanding of a theology for the life of the world, as Miroslav Volf, who's a theologian very much writing in this area, calls it. And it is very much related. But my last question to you is, what can we learn from the situation in the Ukraine? What lessons should we take from the church? You know, the beginning to wake up to a responsibility of the body of Christ for the welfare of the whole society.
Yeah, I think we can learn, as I said, we can learn a lot from the witness and even the martyrdom of Christians in Ukraine, especially the Christians who participated in the Maidan demonstrations, who were not bound by their traditional theology, which taught them to always respect and uphold the powers that be. They developed through their experience of suffering, their experience of pain, they developed a way of living faithfully, living with integrity within a system that in every sense conspired against living life according to their Christian values. So I think we can learn important lessons about how we can respond as Christians to endemic issues in politics and society, social pathologies of corruption, political problems around the abuse of power. And I think that we can learn from the Ukrainian Christians, those who've emerged, those theologians, especially young theologians who've emerged in the aftermath of Maidan, about the need for a theological reading of political events. I think that the evangelical community, my impression at least, is the evangelical community in Western Europe is very ill-equipped to interpret political events, because there isn't really any tradition of offering a biblical or theological perspective on what we might call non-religious or secular events and processes. I think that the Ukrainian theologians, the emerging generation of young Ukrainian theologians, have given us models and examples, not just in the books that they've written, but also in their living witness to what it means to be both a citizen of Ukraine or a citizen of Great Britain or wherever, a citizen of the Netherlands, but also a citizen of heaven, and our responsibilities and obligations, how we can balance those competing claims. So I think that there are all kinds of lessons that we can learn. Those are just to name a few.
Well, thank you, Joshua. I think we'll wrap it up here. The thought crosses my mind, it would be very interesting to have a discussion, a comparison with the scenes on Maidan and the scenes in Washington on January the 6th earlier this year, and the differences and comparisons, but I'll leave that for others to discuss over a pint of beer or something. So we'll finish off here. With the reminder that we do hope to have Thomas Schiermarker joining us next month as our guest on the Schuman Talk. But we're very grateful, Joshua, that you were prepared to come in and be part of our conversation today. Thank you so much.